Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story. What would you do if the love of your life was facing a life or death struggle, carrying not only the weight of her own survival, but the future of your child? Today, we dive into a heart-wrenching journey of love, fate, and the battle against time. Will James be able to stand strong for Diep in her most vulnerable moment? Stay with us till the end to find out. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 followers. Your support means the world. James stood by the window, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun, as his mind raced with anticipation. Tonight was the night he had been planning for months. The night he would propose to Diep. Everything was set. He had reserved the VIP room at their favorite restaurant, ordered the flowers, and arranged for a cake and balloons to make the evening even more special. He had thought of every detail, wanting this moment to be perfect for her. He had called his mother earlier, seeking her approval. The conversation had been difficult. His mother had always been practical, and she had her reservations about Diep. She was from a modest background, with no formal education and no family to speak of. But despite her concerns, James stood firm. He explained that he loved Diep for who she was, not for her past or her circumstances. His mother had hesitated, but in the end, she had given her blessing. "I just want you to be sure," she had said. James had reassured her that he was. He had made up his mind. As he stood there, looking out the window, James couldn't help but think of everything they had been through together. Diep had been through so much, pain, hardship, and loneliness, but despite it all, she had remained kind and strong. She deserved happiness, and he was ready to give it to her. His heart pounded with excitement and fear, knowing that tonight would be the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. He glanced down at the ring in his hand, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't just a ring, it was a promise. Later that afternoon, James sat in the living room, his palms sweaty as he spoke to his mother. The conversation had been long overdue, but it felt even more crucial now that the proposal was so near. He knew it would be difficult for her to understand, but he had to tell her. "Mom, I've made up my mind. Tonight I'm proposing to Diep," James said, trying to steady his voice. His mother, who had always been the one to ground him, sat across from him with a cautious gaze. She didn't respond immediately, her expression unreadable as she looked at him. "James, I know you care about her," his mother finally said, "but you must understand the reality of this. Diep doesn't have the same background as the women you're used to. She doesn't have a family. She doesn't have a proper education. You know what it will be like. It's not going to be easy." James felt the sting of her words but stood firm. "I know, Mom, but that doesn't matter to me. I love her, and I'm willing to take on whatever challenges come with being with her." His mother sighed, the weight of the conversation heavy in the air. She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words against everything she had known for him. "You know that life with her will be hard. But if you're sure, then it's your choice." James nodded, relieved, but still uncertain. He had been waiting for this approval for so long, but a small part of him still questioned if he was ready for what lay ahead. His mother's final words gave him a sense of reassurance, but the doubts still lingered. "I'm sure, Mom. I'm sure." James arrived at the restaurant, his heart racing with excitement. It was supposed to be the night of his life, the night he would ask Diep to be his wife. The table was set, the room beautifully decorated with roses, balloons, and candles flickering in the dim light. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but as he waited for Diep to arrive, something felt wrong. A restless anxiety clawed at him, a sensation he couldn't shake. Just as he checked his watch, his phone buzzed, shattering the stillness of the moment. It was a message from Diep's neighbor. His heart dropped as he read the words. "Diep collapsed. Please come quickly." The message didn't make sense. Diep had been fine earlier, laughing and excited about their dinner plans. Panic surged through James. His breath hitched, and he immediately ran out of the restaurant, rushing toward Diep's house, his mind racing with terrifying possibilities. What could have happened? When he arrived, Diep was unconscious on the floor, surrounded by concerned neighbors. Her face was pale, her body cold to the touch. James knelt beside her, his hand shaking as he tried to wake her. "Diep, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Wake up." The neighbors explained that she had fainted suddenly and had no family to be with her. Panic turned into a desperate urgency. He couldn't lose her, not like this. Without thinking, James lifted her into his arms and rushed her to the hospital, his mind spiraling with worry. All the plans, all the hopes for tonight vanished in an instant. The only thing that mattered now was her life. James sat in the sterile hospital room, the buzzing of the machines the only sound breaking the silence. Diep lay unconscious on the bed, her breathing shallow, the tubes and monitors surrounding her like a suffocating reminder of how fragile life could be. James stared at her, his heart heavy with guilt. She had always been so strong, so full of life. But now she was lying here, fighting for survival, and all he could do was sit helplessly by her side. The doctor had explained that Diep's illness was severe, a rare condition that not only threatened her life, but also her unborn child. The words seemed to echo in his mind as he tried to make sense of everything. How had this happened? Why hadn't he noticed the signs sooner? His thoughts were clouded with regret. He had been so focused on the proposal, so caught up in the excitement of planning their future, that he had missed the warning signs. Now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. "I should have proposed earlier," James whispered to himself, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I should have been there for her." His hands trembled as he reached out to touch Diep's, trying to feel the warmth of her skin, to remind himself that she was still there. But deep down, he knew that nothing would be the same. He had hoped to give her a life full of happiness, but now he was forced to confront the harsh reality that their future was uncertain. As the hours passed, the weight of his guilt became almost unbearable. But one thing remained clear. He couldn't give up on her, not now, not ever. Diep slowly stirred, her eyelids fluttering as the world around her gradually came into focus. The sterile smell of the hospital, the faint beeping of machines, everything felt distant, as if she were floating between dreams and reality. She blinked a few times before her gaze landed on James, who was sitting by her side, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "James?" Her voice was weak, but there was an unmistakable softness to it. Where am I?" James took her hand in his fingers trembling as he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "You're in the hospital, Diep. You collapsed. But don't worry, you're safe now. The doctors are taking care of you." Diep tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, like it no longer belonged to her. She winced in pain and let out a faint sigh. What happened? I feel so tired. James's heart ached seeing her in this state, so fragile, so vulnerable. He wished he could take away all her pain, make everything better. He didn't know how to help her, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let her go through this alone. The doctors said you've been really sick, Diep, he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. And the baby. They said your condition is affecting the pregnancy too. Diep's face paled further as the words sunk in. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want to drag you into all of this. James's heart broke as he leaned in, gently brushing her hair from her face. You didn't drag me into anything. I'm here because I love you, and I'll be here no matter what happens. Diep's eyes met his, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. She nodded, too weak to speak, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. James made a silent vow then and there. He would be her strength. He would never leave her, no matter how difficult it became. This was just the beginning of their journey together. The days stretched on in the hospital, each moment heavier than the last. James stayed by Diep's side, watching as she slowly recovered, but the worry never left his heart. The doctors had told him that Diep would need to stay in the hospital for several more days, and even then, there was no certainty about her condition. Her illness was rare, and the danger it posed to both her and the baby was still looming over them. James couldn't escape the constant flood of thoughts that weighed on him. He had always been someone who planned ahead, who believed that love could conquer any obstacle. But this was different. This wasn't something he could fix with a well-timed proposal or a grand gesture. It was real, it was raw, and it terrified him. He kept asking himself, what if she doesn't make it? What if I lose her? His mind wandered back to the night of the proposal, the one he had envisioned for so long. He had imagined Diep's smile, the joy in her eyes as she said yes. But now, all that seemed so distant, so uncertain. The future he had dreamed of felt fragile, as if it could shatter with a single misstep. But then, he would look at her, her face pale but still beautiful, still holding on, still fighting, and he knew he couldn't give up. No matter how difficult it got, no matter how uncertain the future seemed, he had to stay strong for her, for the both of them. Diep, even in her weakened state, could still muster a smile for him. And in those small moments, James found the strength to keep going. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, but all he could do was hope and wait. James sat quietly by Diep's bed, the soft hum of the hospital room around them. Diep had finally managed to rest, her breathing more even than it had been for days. James had been there every moment, his body aching from the long hours of sleepless nights. His mind had been filled with worry and guilt, but now, watching Diep's slow recovery, a new sense of hope was creeping into his heart. The doctors had told him that Diep's condition had stabilized for the moment, though there were still many uncertainties ahead. But for now, they had time, and that was all James needed. Time to cherish her, to hold her, to love her in ways he had never done before. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was not going to let go. Not now. Not ever. The past few days had tested him in ways he had never imagined. The fear, the helplessness, the overwhelming guilt. It had all nearly broken him. But now, Sitting beside Diep, his hand gently resting on hers, he realized that all the doubts, all the questions, didn't matter as much anymore. Life was fragile, and he understood that now more than ever. But it was also beautiful. Diep had given him something he hadn't realized he needed, a reason to fight for something beyond himself. He didn't know what the future held, whether they would have a lifetime together or not. But as long as Diep was with him, he would make sure she knew she wasn't alone. "Diep," he whispered softly, leaning closer, his voice full of conviction. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together. I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone in this." Diep stirred slightly, her eyes opening. She smiled faintly at him, her hand tightening around his. "I know, James. I know." And in that moment, despite the uncertainty of tomorrow, James found a sense of peace. He had done all he could for her, and now all he could do was hope that love, with all its quiet power, would be enough to carry them both through whatever came next.
Câu chuyện xoay quanh Diệp, một cô gái nghèo khó thiếu thốn tình cảm gia đình, đang mang thai đứa con của James. Liệu người yêu cô, James, chuẩn bị cầu hôn Diệp, nhưng trước đêm quan trọng cô bất ngờ ghẻ và nặng, đe dọa đến tính mạng của cả hai, cô và thai nhi trong bụng. James cảm thấy hối hận vì không đề xuất sớm hơn và lo lắng cho tương lai của họ. Trong suốt thời gian Diệp nhập viện, James luôn ở bên đó, bên cô, đối mặt với những khó khăn, tự hỏi liệu tình yêu và hy vọng đều có thể vượt qua mọi thử thách. Dù biết không có gì chắc chắn, nhưng James quyết định không bỏ cuộc, luôn đứng vững bên cô cùng vượt qua khó khăn.